So these are the Blon minis. This is Blon's latest attempt to let music and dreams burn, or whatever the motto was. And although the shell is probably one of the most comfortable shells that I've used in a while, although they do look quite odd, they look like some macaronis, the sound is a completely different story altogether. And we'll get to that once we get over the disclaimer. And just as well, a disclaimer, this unit was provided by Brian. He bought them with his own money. We're not associated towards any brand or any company whatsoever. So this review will be completely of my own opinion. And yeah, that's about it. So before we get into just the sound and everything, I also want to just gloss over the packaging and etc. There's not a lot of it, so just stick with me a little bit here. So packaging is quite simple. They've changed to this very slim box. I don't know why. These kind of remind me of the boxes that chopsticks come in. Where we buy one of those expensive boxes. You get 5 pairs of ear tips. You get a small pouch, which is made out of some material. I'm not sure what material this is. The 5 ear tips that they provide are quite similar to the ears that you get in the Blon 03, and that's all about that you get when you purchase the Blons. And the IEMs themselves, I think, in terms of build quality, and by the way, these ear tips are not provided in your purchase package. These are the ear tips that I used to test these Blons because they gave me the best fit. The included ear tips didn't fit me quite well. They kept on pushing out. They couldn't sit in my ears that well. These are just reversed, inverted Knowledge Zenith Starline ear tips. Yeah, and the speaking of ear tips, the nozzle of the IEMs, they're quite standard size, so any ear tips will fit quite well. Although they are a bit on the smaller end, so if you have ear tips that are a bit worn, they might slip off. But normally, any other ear tips should just fit. Any other standard ear tip should fit just fine on the shell. The overall build quality of these Blons, the shell and all, I think they feel, in terms of material, they feel very similar to the original Blon 03s. They are made out of this sort of like metal. I didn't have any like electrocution problem or grounding issue when I was using these Blons, unlike the Blon 03s. I don't know why that would be. The same should have applied here as well, but you know, that's a good thing, I guess. The shell overall nowadays is way more comfortable than the 03s. These I think will fit a lot more people better. This is more or less, in terms of like ergonomics, this feels like a normal IEM. It's just shaped very oddly, and because of this odd shape and the fact that it actually doesn't really weigh much, although it's made out of metal, it'll sit quite comfortably on your ears. This ear hook that they also have is already preformed in the cable, and the overall cable itself also feels quite nice, and it actually helps support some of the weight of the Blons. And overall, I think this cable itself is also quite nice. It's quite supple. It isn't too microphonic. The Blons also have an optional microphone that you can get. My current model here has this microphone attached. You can get one without the microphone. I believe it'll be cheaper. I think this model costs around like $30 US. Might differ a bit in your area, of course, or your distributor. The jack is unfortunately still a straight jack. For mobile devices, I would always want angle jacks because these get stuck in your pocket and just hang off your phone or dap or whatever, and then it just will break your jacks and your ports quite easily. Aside from that, another major change that I glossed over, I forgot to mention, is that the Blon minis, they don't have any vents on the front, so these are fully isolated IEMs. So the isolation on these are exceptional. So if you want to go out and about with these IEMs, I think these will do very well because the isolation is actually pretty great on these. Now that we've gone over build quality and packaging, we'll just go straight into sound. And just as a summary, the Blon minis overall sound quite like the more L-shaped, with just like a sort of a sparkle in the treble somewhere. I wouldn't really call this a V-shape. There's just some sections of the treble which are quite emphasized, and there's quite a bit of an emphasis on the low end. The mid-range, although it seems recessed, it's not really recessed, it just feels distant. Right, so to me it sounds more like an L shape, with just a little bit of hint of sparkle in the treble. Now, to get into more detail on how these sound, we'll start off with bass like we usually do. So the bass of the Blon Minis are actually okay control in terms of control wise. I think the speed is sort of like a medium to slow end. They're not the fastest bass, and they don't really have the best texture as well. So if you listen to very fast music, I think they'll fall apart quite quickly. Although most songs like EDMs and such, I think this will handle fine. But if you listen to stuff like Dragon Force, they'll fall apart quite quickly actually. Sub-bass extension also isn't the best, and it heavily depends on the level of isolation that you get with the Blon Minis. I found this especially prevalent on these than it does on other IEMs. I'm not sure exactly why that will be. It's probably because of that smaller driver that they have compared to other IEMs. Might be. And although overall control is okay, there is quite a lot of bleed into the mid-range. Bass is quite emphasized as well. Should have mentioned that earlier. But overall, I think if you just like emphasized bass, I think this will be quite satisfactory for you. If you're a heavy bass head, I don't think this will have enough quantity, and the overall kick and slam might not be satisfactory enough for you. Although the kick and slam, I think for most people should be enough. They're not the best like, at all in terms of bass, but I think they're quite good. Like, I can tolerate them. Now, when we go into the mid-range, this is probably where that bass bleed helps a bit in this lower mid-range, being more present. There's quite a bit of weight in the lower mids. It's quite thick as well. But the very odd thing about the Blon Minis is that overall mid-range feels very distant. It doesn't feel recessed. It just feels distant. It's not like it's back in the mix. It just feels very far away from you for some reason. I'm not sure how this happens. To me, this sounds very odd. It kind of sounded like that. What was it? Like the Tanjim Tanyas, but with inappropriate ear tips. It sounds off to me sometimes. Some people might like this presentation, but I'm not a huge fan of it. But overall, just the general timbre and just overall mid-range itself does sound quite good. Like, if it weren't that distant, it would sound quite good, I would say. I've tried switching ear tips, putting in bigger bows, smaller bows, all those things. Nothing helped. So, yeah. Separation and detail in the mid-range is also just average. It's definitely not the best. But I think I don't have a lot of complaints aside from that fact that they sound very distant. Now, the treble region of the Blon's Minis is probably the part where I take most offense with. So the treble region most of the time feels quite smooth, non-offensive, it's not aggressive, but for some reason in cymbals, it just sounds very compressed and just very harsh for some reason. I'm not sure how that even happens. So it does sound like some sort of like it sounds very artificial. It kind of sounds like compression on YouTube. Right? So if you listen to very compressed music on YouTube, this is kind of how the treble cymbal region sounds like on the Blon Minis, and I'm not sure how that even happens here. Because the rest of the treble, I have no issues. It doesn't really have any big problems with sibilance whatsoever. It's just that for cymbals specifically, it sounds very off. It sounds very like harsh and just crunched and unpleasant. Extension also isn't the best. To me, these start falling off after 13k. I'm unable to hear anything beyond 13k with these. My hearing stops at around 17k. Okay, but aside from that, the treble speed in general, I think it's just medium. It's not the fastest treble in the world. So if you listen to Dragon Force, etc., it'll fall apart quite quickly. Now, putting that into perspective, the soundstage of the Blons, right? is again quite odd because the mid-range sounds very distant, but the rest of the sound doesn't. So if, for example, this were your head, right? If this were your head, the soundstage of the Blonds, everything else, so the bass, the treble, etc., sounds like it's just a little bit inside your head. So the soundstage feels actually quite wider uh, than I would initially have thought because of the isolation and just the general emphasis in bass, right? But the mid-range, for example, for some reason sounds like it's just on the edge of my head, right? It feels quite a bit wider than the rest of the frequency range. I'm not sure how that even happens, but yeah, so soundstage wise I would say the Blon Minis are actually quite capable. It's just that the distance between the mid-range and the bass just feels off a lot of times. Now, when we talk about the imaging of the Blon Minis, the imaging wasn't too great. I was only able to perceive an accuracy of like 55-ish degrees, and I would say that's okay, acceptable, not the best, especially. But these two sections, the soundstage and imaging section, I would like to remind you to just take it with a huge grain of salt, because my perception of soundstage and imaging differs quite greatly compared to other reviews that I've read about the Blon Minis. Because I needed just a bit of confirmation whether or not I was going insane or something. Right. So aside from that, if we were to talk in terms of comparison, how these perform against stuff on this similar price range, how do these compare to the original Blon 03s and all those things, right? So I think the Blon Minis, compared to the original Blons, the Blon 03s, I think the bass is better controlled. I feel the 03s have better texture than the Blon Minis do. So it's kind of like you're sacrificing one thing for another, right? You can either get better control, or you can lose a bit of texture, or you can get better texture and lose more control, and you lose some speed as well. Mid-range wise, I would say the Blon Minis, albeit them being quite distant, I think the quality of reproduction feels quite similar to the 03s, but the 03s I think just a bit better than the Blon Minis to me. The treble region, I think the 03s win compared to these, and yeah, I would say honestly the 03s are still a better pick if you can get the fit quite right, and if you don't mind how the bass is presented in the 03s, because they can be quite loose and just uncontrolled at times, right? And the amount of emphasis in the 03s are a bit more than the minis as well, so yeah, just keep that in mind. Now, compared to something else in this price range, compared to something like the Tanjim Tanya, which is a bit cheaper, the Tanjim Tanyas, I think, to me the Tanjim Tanyas are overall a better pick. I think overall the Tanyas, if you get the fit right, because initially when I was reviewing them, I also had the problem where the mid-range just seemed very distant. When I swapped the tips to the wider bore one that was provided in the box, it felt quite a bit closer, and I think was closer to what was probably intended. At that point, I think the Tanyas just overall they just win over the minis. In terms of bass quantity, I think they're quite similar, right? So in mid-range production, I would say that the Blon Minis are a bit thicker, but quite more distant than the Tanyas. Upper mids, the Tanyas are a bit more aggressive compared to the Blon Minis. The treble region of the Blon Minis, they have this sort of like, again, this like crunch, aggression, compression, whatnot in these cymbals. So that's quite annoying, which is not present in the Tanjim Tanyas. So yeah, I would say that if you wanted to try out the Blon Minis, you would have to try it out in person. I'm not sure that a lot of people would be a fan of the Blon Minis. Even if you were a fan of the Blon 03s, I'm not sure that you would like the Blon Minis. So yeah, and this might be because of a fitting issue, or just the ear tips issue, or whatever. I'm not exactly sure yet, because the same had I had issues with the Tajim Tanya previously, so I've been just second guessing myself whenever I feel the mid-range feels quite distant. But yeah. Anyway, I think that pretty much wraps it up for my review. And subscribe if you want content like this, like if you like this video, and comment what you think. And I'll see you guys next time.